Hello, how are you? I hope you're doing well. And today I want to talk with you a little bit about the historic transition that some people say we have moved into today. The postmodern era, or as Anthony Giddens thinks of it, he thinks we're in the late modern era. Some people call it postmodern. And then there's a new term after 2001 for our period, perhaps, the hypermodern era. So the naming of eras is a particularly tricky thing because it's really hard to name something when you're in it. There's an old joke that fish have never discovered water, right? They're in it, and so it's hard to recognize it. In the past, though, we realized that sociology was born out of that transition from the traditional period, which you could roughly say, again, pre-1600, into the modern period, which again, really rough approximate dates, 1750-ish to 1950s. All right, so we've talked about this before, and the key idea, and I'm hoping that you can zoom in on this slide so that you can see it better, but the key idea that bridged the traditional and the modern period we've talked about before, the Enlightenment. So again, Enlightenment promotes reason and rationality, science and secularization, progress with a capital P, and individual freedom. Okay, this intellectual movement helped facilitate a whole bunch of changes, taking us from traditional style living to modern living. And we went through these categories in an earlier set of lectures. What I want to focus on specifically here is the move from the modern period to the postmodern. In the modern period, you have a diversity of Judeo-Christian religion. So while traditional, you have the dominance of the Catholic Church, one church, you start to see different churches emerging in the modern period. And that trend toward increased diversification and fragmentation is going to be a key theme you'll see over and over again in this transition from moving to traditional, modern, and then postmodern. So these days, we don't just have a diversity of Judeo-Christian religions. We have all kinds of religious diversity. We have non-religion, atheism, agnostics. We have New Age religion. We have people who believe in crystals. If you were to look at a basic chart of faith in the United States, I'm looking at one now from 2008, mainline Protestants make up 18% of the population. Unaffiliated with any church is 16% of the US population. Evangelical Protestants are 26% of the population. You've got Buddhists at 0.7%, Jehovah's Witnesses, 0.7%, Jewish people 1.7%, a whole range of different options for faith today. Some people argue that we also have religious buffets where people say, for example, say they believe in a particular faith like Catholicism, but then they pick and choose what they want to believe within that faith. Like they say, well, I'm a Catholic, but I use birth control. So again, we're in a more open era with more options and fragmentation than in the past. And you'll see this all the way through this chart. In the past, traditional era, pre-1600, we had monarchs ruling by divine right. In the era of the nation state, people were seen as citizens. They were not subjects of a king or queen. And these days, we have more of a national politics of identity. So people sometimes feel like they have a national ethnic heritage, like people will say, I'm Irish American. And also, too, national politics of identity refers to the making of identity through memorials, monuments, museums, and the kind of cultural understanding of certain national identities. Also today, we have a move from people being seen as citizens to consideration of people as having human rights. So rights are not just the thing connected with a state today. Rights are also connected with for example, being a human. In the past, feudalism, production for immediate consumption. Capitalism, the system that we talked about, central to the modern era, this idea of production for trade. And today, we have the rise of multi- or transnational capitalism, multinational capitalism, transnational capitalism. So on a chart that I have here, the number of multinational corporations in 1750, around the world, there were only 1,250 multinational corporations in 1750. By 1914, there were 3,000 of these. So they've doubled from 1750 to 1914. Today, there are over 60,000 multinational corporations in existence. So it's an astronomical rocketing up of the number of these entities across the world. So this is a whole new type of capitalism which uses globalization in order to facilitate the production, development, and distribution of products. What was the important source of self-identity in the past? Like I said before, communal ties. Then we moved to smaller family units. Work and family became an important source of how one thought of themselves in the modern era. Today, consumption and purchasing are important sources of self-identity. We have the notion of lifestyle purchases. People are connected with certain fashions or brand names. People want to consume based on labels and see themselves in relation to the products that they buy. The products they buy and enjoy are indications of how they feel about themselves. A key thing I need you to think about is what happened around 1950 and 1945. 1945 marked the end of World War II. So that makes a natural sort of break historically between the modern era and what some people call the postmodern era. You had the killing of 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews in Europe during World War II. And that occurred by using some of the very technologies promoted during the modern period, like factory, industrial-based production. You had factories of death at Auschwitz. And also, you had the development of the atomic bomb that resulted in mass death at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With these trends, you can talk a little bit then about a move toward a crisis of science. So religion dominated in the traditional period. You had organized science that started to take over in the modern period. But after 1945, we learned that science can't necessarily save us from ourselves. Science can, in fact, lead to our species' extinction through nuclear weapons, for example. So there's a big crisis of science and what it can do in post-1945 America and the world. You have extended families in the traditional period moving to smaller nuclear families in the modern. Nuclear families are 2 generations under one roof. And these days you have what people call the breakdown of the family. You have blended families where parents with other children come together and form families. You have single-parent families. You have gay families. So again, the fragmentation and wild distribution, you could say, of different types of families emerging these days. We went from rural life to urban life, and these days a move to the suburbs and what's called the exurbs, or areas outside of the city. Agricultural production dominated in the traditional period. We had factories in the industrial period in modern times. These days, we have computer-based production, robotic production. We have digital-based production and post-Fordism. Fordism really dominated during the modern period, where Henry Ford developed an assembly line to make the Model T and broke it down broke down the process into very, very fine parts. Post-Fordism relates to what's called just-in-time production. And these are techniques that are used to build things today which are not rooted in having a surplus of goods that's then assembled and sold to a mass market. The goods are brought together when a consumer places an order, and they don't have a lot of assembly stock held in factories. So things have changed in terms of our production processes today. Also, you can make a move toward thinking about how our globalized economy has transferred a lot of manufacturing from the United States to places like China, Asia. And so the world economy is now involved in the manufacturing process, global assembly lines. In the past, culture you had controlled by religion in the traditional period. In the modern era, you see the rise of secularization. So art becomes more secular, and you have high elite culture developing. These days, you see the rise of mass culture, pop culture. There's a crisis of high culture because we have a loss of aesthetic standards. In this particular period, you could argue anything goes. What makes for a good work of art? Do you like it or not? Some people say, well, is that art? And other people say, well, I don't know. It looks like my kid could make that. So this idea of a kind of a crisis of high culture, what separates elites from others, especially when you can have things like knockoff products, for example. Primary relationships, we talked about with the theorist Georg Simmel. You had primary relations that were emphasized in the traditional period. The modern period gives rise to secondary relationships. In our contemporary era, we have the rise of tertiary relationships, human-machine interactions, and the work of Donna Haraway in particular. She's called for an anthropology of cyborgs, or the relationship between humans and machines as a new form of relationship. The self in the past really was not separable from the communal life period. People didn't see themselves as individuals at all in the same way we do today. The modern period started to emphasize more individualism, and the self was rational, stable, self had feelings, intellect. These days, you can think of the self as, like Goffman does, multiple. And some people would argue schizophrenic. We have many different selves that we show to many different people. Sometimes it's hard to track all of them. It's the idea that the self may not be as unified as maybe we once thought, and our era causes us to have many different separate realms of our life, so that promotes a new sense of thinking of the self. Okay, so this is the last part of the vulgar history that we're going through. And again, each of these historic periods is contested in terms of when it starts, when it ends, and whether or not the characteristics are actually demarking a new period or continuation of some of the trends from the older period, the previous period. It's very hard to know what the trends are in the era in which you're in, and whether or not they're fully separable from things in the past. Nevertheless, we have some theorists today who argue that we're in what's called the hypermodern era. In particular, a fellow named Gilles Lipovetsky is arguing that we are in the title of his book, Hypermodern Times. So it's up to you to evaluate the extent to which these things seem to hold true. But you can certainly argue that 2001 marked a change in the world through the terrorist attacks on 9/11, the World Trade Center, and the rise of global terrorism, a whole sort of sea change in terms of political relations, social cultural relations, and the role technology plays on and in our everyday lives. So again, this parallels roughly the same columns and discussion topics that we had in the previous slide. So in the past, we had the Catholic Church dominating, then we moved to more diversity of Judeo-Christian faiths in the modern era. Today we see a rise in fundamentalism, and that is both in Islamic countries, but also in some Western countries and in the United States, fundamentalist churches on the rise. We have an ongoing religiosity, and what I mean by that is that the idea of secularism promoted by the Enlightenment has not become a complete and totalizing project. We still have very much a religious culture in the US and in the world. Also, though, we have secular culture, an ongoing secular culture. So these things seem to mark our contemporary era. We have moved from the idea of monarchs to nation states to national politics of identity to globalization today, glocalization, which is a hybrid word, but it means the idea that local things can then have an effect on the global world. For example, these days you also see tacos being sold all over the world. You can see also too local types of food being offered in McDonald's, for example, in Asia. And so this interconnection between the local and the global. We have the rise of eco-citizens and eco-citizenship, people valuing the natural world and ecology over state politics and other political concerns. And also, too, the rise of terrorist organizations and the identification of people with those organizations superseding, perhaps, their national identity or patriotic identities. We have moved from feudalism to capitalism and then to transnational capitalism, multinational capitalism today. And these days you can say that we've entered into cycles of financial crises. So this parallels some of Immanuel Wallerstein's thinking, along with government stabilization. So a new kind of economic structure linked to Keynesian economics and the state's role increasingly in stabilizing the market. Our most important source of self-identity today, as I argued for the postmodern era, some people say it's consumption and purchasing. Lipovetsky argues that really it's not about buying products as a means of making a self. It's really about trying to be happy. Instead of buying Nike because you want to be connected with that certain product, you just like Nike. You're searching for happiness and pleasure. People seem to be more oriented toward immediate gratification. Your cell phone, the idea of finding out information in real time, searching your computer for funny videos on YouTube, the idea of a distraction-based culture, that it's harder and harder for people to focus on, for example, traditional things like books. There's a constant search, Lipovetsky argues, for things like novelty. And there are recent researchers who are interested in the intensification of mobility today. We are highly mobile, and we can travel the globe. We often are moving around, and we probably move more than any other people preceding us. Science and progress has also perhaps changed in our terms of our thinking. These days we have a kind of a funny relationship with science. There are people who believe that it can save us from things like environmental catastrophe, from global climate change and the concerns that we have about global climate change. Science can save us from pollution, perhaps. We can colonize other planets, for example. But there's also another fear that science can't save us, that science can actually produce, for example, frankenfood, biologically, genetically engineered food that may end up killing us. We may create superbugs that are leading to our own demise. Hypermodernity might also be characterized as moving away from postmodern trends of blended families, gay families, single-parent families, to consider other things, marriage being in decline. Today we have more personal definitions of family. So we have both biological family, but also the notion that family is almost completely socially constructed for many people. Some people will have a biological parent that they do not consider a parent. So family relates to statuses that people can assign by their own choice. Families are also increasingly alone together, and that's a phrase used by Sherry Turkle. And the idea is that families used to be places where people's needs were met within the context of a space and people interacting. These days, families are also about people who are separated on their own computers, their own video screens, engaged in their own activities. So families are also springboards for heavy individualism these days. As one example, in the family that I grew up in, we had a phone, a single phone. And these days, everyone in the family may have their own individual phone. So we are alone, separate, together. And the idea of family itself is also greatly contested these days. What counts as family? As I mentioned before, we move from rural to urban life and suburban, exurban in the postmodern era. These days, we have hypermobility. We have people who may work in one part of the world and travel in another part, travel home to another part of the world. My brother-in-law, amazingly enough, lived in Bend, Oregon, and commuted to Hawaii every week for 6 months. Commuted to Hawaii and back to Bend every week for 6 months. So he was a very valuable employee. He did information technology and had, I'm sure, probably a million air miles within a very short period of time. The work-home distinction is blurring for a lot of people with the laptop, the cell phone. And these are changes that make it so that we move around and don't even think necessarily in terms of rural, urban, or suburban space. Production these days is fascinating. We have 3D printing and 4D printing. 3D printers, they have one at UNK. They are able to make products basically kind of like you would have a Xerox copy of a paper. They can make a copy of an object, like for example this stapler. If you put it in a 3D printer, it will understand the spatial orientation of this and the dimensions, and then be able to reproduce this in its own form, in a kind of a plastic form. Some of these are able to be integrated into moving parts and products that work, machines. Others were not quite at that stage yet, but we're at the first stages of individually being able to produce and manufacture things. This is a huge change in human history. 4D printing, you can print products and make products that the fourth dimension means time. So in terms of time, you can have products that assemble themselves. So perhaps you might get a bookshelf from IKEA in the future, where if you sprinkle it with water, the water changes the cellular structure of this object and then makes it build itself. So the day is coming where these things are actually happening. Crowdsourcing means using larger crowds to beta test products, to, for example, write novels. People are distributing their works over the internet, getting comment and feedback, incorporating those things, and then revising and producing the products that they are creating. We've moved from primary to secondary relationships. Secondary relationships were growing in the modern era. Then we had tertiary relationships in the postmodern era. These days you could argue we're in digital relationships, human-electronic relations, virtual relations, people who use social networks, Facebook, people who communicate through email. They develop virtual personas through things like, for example, Second Life, the place where you can develop an avatar, and also to maybe other avatar development virtual spaces where people interact. Finally, the sense of self these days, some people argue that it's very much mediated right? The selfie, the photograph that you take of yourself that you then put online, the online personas that we create. Is that who we are? Is that a part of us? So the self is seen as mediated, very much mobile, based differently on different situations. So protean, changing, virtual, digital, as I've said. And we also these days engage in body projects, seeing our body as a source of work that we can do on it through things like exercise, body modifications, tattooing, piercing, dieting, some of the things that Anthony Giddens talked about, and body projects that we see more of in the work of people like Mike Featherstone. Also to our image-based sense of self. You know, are we aging appropriately? Does that picture really reflect who we think of ourselves as being? And so some of the work that I look at through Simon Gottschalk relates to, for example, digital relationships, our self as mediated, virtual through Second Life, for example, and our avatars, and also body projects and the focus on the body as new through the works of theorists like Mike Featherstone.